Preparing the walls for Select Board Batten vertical siding is much like it is for the horizontal panels. Make sure that you have a weather protective barrier system, appropriate flashings, furring strips around all windows and doors as well as outside corners, and remember, the inside corners go on prior to the siding panels. When the wall has an inside corner, it's easiest to install the panels from the inside corner out. There needs to be a 1/2 inch gap between the panels and the inside of the corner, and it's important that the panels be hung plumb. Because the 1/2 inch will be difficult to gauge when installing the first panel, I'm measuring over 2 inches from the corner and placing some trim nails as a stop for the panel prior to installing the inside corner. I just drive them in far enough that the head of the nail will ride over top of the panel. For the best overall appearance when installing board batten siding, you'll want to end up with a balanced wall. In other words, you'll want to end up with the same distance from this batten strip to this corner as you do on the opposite corner. To achieve this, you'll want to use the following calculation. First, take a measurement of the length of the wall from inside the furring strip, or in this case, inside of the corner, to the inside of the opposite furring strip. Subtract 1 inch from the measurement. For this wall, that's 116. The panel exposure is 8 inches, so divide the number by 8. This gives you the number of panels the wall requires. In my case, it's 14 1/2 panels. Take the leftover, or in my case, 1/2 a panel, and divide that by 2. Add 3/8 of an inch to compensate for the panel lock. This gives you the width of the first panel. I've ripped my first panel down and installed it by placing it against my trim nails that I've previously installed underneath the inside corner and fastening it to the wall. You'll notice I struck a line at the bottom of this wall. That just represents the foundation line. To keep the bottom of the panels aligned straight across the wall all year round, place a nail at the top of one slot within the first 12 inches of the panels. This will keep the bottom aligned, keep the panels from sliding down, and force all the expansion and contraction to happen within that 1 inch gap at the top between the panels and the furring strip. Of course, that will be eventually covered by a trim board. We'll use this same nailing pattern for the remainder of the wall. Because most of the expansion and contraction happens with the board and batten vertical product vertically and not horizontally, we don't need a 1 inch gap along the jambs of the windows and doors. We can narrow that down to a 1/2 inch. The gaps for expansion and contraction below and above windows and doors can also be 1/2 inch if the distance from the bottom of the panel is less than 8 feet. If the distance is more than 8 feet, the gap must be 1 inch. I'm now ready to install the final piece in the wall, but first let's review. I aligned all the board and batten pieces along my foundation line evenly. I placed a nail in the top of a slot within the first 12 inches. I center nailed the remainder nails loosely at about 12-inch intervals, and I left an inch gap at the top between the panel and the furring strip to allow for the expansion and contraction of the panels. Now, the first thing I need to do before I can install this final part, because I cut off all the nail slots, is I need to pre-drill a hole within the first 12 inches or so toward the bottom of the panel. That'll act as my pinpoint. Once I've nailed this to the wall, then the remainder of the nails all the way up the wall at 12-inch intervals, I will just ride along the edge of the panel. This will hold that panel back, and of course all this gets covered by trim anyway. The last step in the process, of course, is to install the trim. The outside corners, window and door trim, trim along the top of the wall, all that's covered in the trim video. However, one thing to note when installing trim on a board and batten project is this. When trimming around a window, for instance, you may end up with a bit of a gap behind the trim because the batten strip actually falls beyond the trim. You could either leave that go, or you could close it in with a couple different ways. First, you might want to use a piece of lattice strip and glue the lattice strip to the back of the trim, paint it accordingly to match the trim, and make the trim board actually look just a bit thicker around the windows. Or you could cut a batten strip off of a panel, glue that to the back. I offset mine back just a bit to give more reveal on the window trim, and install it that way, creating a shadow line that's the same color as the board and batten siding. If your wall is taller than one full length of board and batten siding, such as on a two-story home, you will need to create a band board. Install the furring strip, leave the 1-inch gap for expansion and contraction, install the trim board, then install some flashing to guard against water intrusion, and you can now begin to install the second course of board and batten siding. Make sure and leave 1/4 of an inch gap between the siding and the flashing. And remember, within the first 12 inches of the panels, place a nail at the top of one slot. The remainder of the fasteners are all centered in the nailing slots.